Welcome to AccessLex Institute's presentation, Make the Case for Legal Education. I'm Nancy Keneally, Director of Policy, and with me today is Keenan Thompson, Policy Associate. Here at AccessLex Institute, we are focused on improving access, affordability, and the value of legal education. Through our Center on Legal Education Excellence, we advocate for policies and conduct research on critical issues facing legal education today. Through our Center on Education and Financial Capability, we offer on-campus and online financial education programming through presentations by our field staff and through our Max Financial Education Program. And just a reminder that registration for Max is open until June 30th. In addition to the advocacy that we do, you also play an important role in making sure that the changes you want to see in the law become a reality. And we are here as a resource for you to make the case for legal education. During today's webinar, we will review how changes can and have been made to federal higher education policy. We will explore the current political landscape, examine a recent advocacy campaign to better understand the impact that your advocacy can have on the issues you care about. We will walk you through our advocacy campaign, Make the Case, and the resources we provide. And finally, we will let you know about the ways that you can get involved. First, we will turn to the federal law impacting higher education. Briefly, the Higher Education Act was originally enacted in 1965 and has always been focused on providing access to higher education for those that may not have otherwise been able to afford it. While there are several parts to the law, the most relevant to our discussion is Title IV, which covers federal student aid. The current version of the law, the Higher Education Opportunity Act, was last authorized in 2008 and has been expired since 2003. It simply remains in effect each year until reauthorization. But reauthorization is not the only way to make changes to the law. Congress can also use a procedure called budget reconciliation to make changes with a simple majority. This could become very important because in the Senate, the Republicans lack the 60 votes needed to pass legislation, but they do have a simple majority. And we have seen Congress use budget reconciliation several times over the last decade to make significant changes to the federal student loan program. For example, in 2005, it was used to create the Grad Plus program. In 2007, it created the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program and added more income-driven repayment plans. And in 2010, it eliminated FFELP loans and expanded direct lending. It also added additional income-driven repayment plans. So as you can see, budget reconciliation is a very important legislative procedure when you think about how changes can be made to federal aid policy. And this is something that we will return to several times during this presentation. The Department of Education can also make changes through the regulatory process. We have seen this done in recent years in the areas of gainful employment and borrower defense to repayment. And a fifth income-driven repayment plan, REPAY, was also created through regulation in 2015. So rather than a large, comprehensive HEA reauthorization bill, we may see more incremental changes through budget reconciliation and regulations. So these are two things that you should keep an eye on in addition to conversations about reauthorization. I also want to briefly walk through AccessLex Institute's HEA priorities. On your screen, you will see our top 4 priorities. These include simplification of income-driven repayment plans. We believe there should only be one IDR plan and that changes should be made in a way that don't harm current borrowers. We also support maintaining the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program in order to encourage more individuals to enter public service jobs. We would also like to see the law changed to allow federal loans to be used to pay for the costs associated with obtaining a professional license, such as those incurred during the bar exam. And we believe that schools should have the flexibility to require students to engage in annual loan counseling to provide students with the information they need to make the best financial decisions. And you can find our full list of HEA priorities on our website, accesslex.org. These focus on other federal financial aid issues, financial education, and data collection. So what are Congress's priorities for HEA? Over the last several years, we have seen proposals that cover our priority areas, but not always in a good way. Everyone agrees that FAFSA needs to be shortened, so we will likely see that happen in reauthorization. But the question is, how short will it be? There is also bipartisan support to simplify IDR, but the devil is in the details on this one. The president's proposal would increase monthly payments and years to forgiveness for graduate students, which is something that AccessLex does not support. We have also seen proposals from both sides of the aisle to curtail PSLF. President Trump proposed elimination in his recent budget, and President Obama proposed a cap to forgiveness at the undergraduate borrowing limit. This is an example of a policy proposal that is based on finding budget savings than the merits of the program necessarily. And just to note that this change could be made through budget reconciliation because it would find savings in the budget. And again, as a reminder, that's a procedure that only requires a simple majority. There's also bipartisan support for increasing the amount of loan counseling for borrowers. Some proposals would require this annual counseling, and others would simply give schools flexibility to do so. And finally, there's also bipartisan support for increasing accountability, but this is another place where details matter. Most of the buzz in this area is around institutional risk sharing or putting schools on the hook for their students' ability to repay their federal student loans. Next, I'm going to talk about the current political landscape. This context is important to understanding how Congress is supposed to work and what is actually happening right now as you prepare to reach out to your members of Congress. According to tradition and congressional rules, authorizing bills such as HEA and spending bills are supposed to happen roughly in the order laid out on the screen, and these should be two separate processes. First, when crafting a reauthorization bill, Congress has traditionally wanted input from the public. This process is supposed to take months or even years and provides an opportunity for Congress to hear from constituents like you and national organizations like AccessLex. It also allows the public to know what is going on, what bills are moving, what's in the bills, etc. But the reality is that these things can happen very quickly or very slowly. It depends on what leadership wants to do and what other priorities they're dealing with. The budget and appropriations process is supposed to follow a set schedule each year with specific timelines and deadlines. While these bills are meant only to fund programs, they have increasingly been used in recent years to make policy changes as reauthorization bills stall. As I mentioned earlier, budget reconciliation is one way to use the budget process to make significant changes to federal student aid. The most important takeaway here is that the process is not happening this way, and so as advocates, you can get caught off guard as things move more quickly than expected. So it's important to stay informed and engaged about what Congress is working on. So what does the process look like this year? Some things have been delayed, but others have been fast-tracked. The fiscal year 2017 appropriations bill was 7 months late. It was passed in May when it should have been passed by last October 1st. The president's budget was also late. However, that is typical for incoming administrations as they get their feet under them and figure out what their priorities are. And neither chamber has passed their FY18 budget resolution yet, which should have been done in April. And this sets spending levels for appropriations bills. However, Congress has started on their spending bills without a budget resolution. They're simply using last year's levels. And the reason some of these things have been delayed is because, as you know, they have been largely focused on healthcare. So the main point here is that they are way behind schedule on high priority issues, and things like HEA are getting pushed back. And it's important to note, and you can see on the slide, that there is a recess coming up in August. So in July, we could see a lot of action as Congress tries to get things passed before they leave town for a month. When they return in September, they will be focused on spending bills because they need to get those passed before October 1st. Right now, they hope to finish healthcare in July and then move on to tax reform in the fall, but we don't really know what will happen. And why don't we know? Well, there are a lot of things at play that impact how quickly Congress moves and what they focus on. The first is the calendar. Some must-pass legislation is on a set deadline and thus must take priority. Congress also spends a lot of time at home in their state and district, leaving less time to do things like draft bills, conduct hearings, and vote. But with them back home, that is a good time for you to educate your members, invite them to your school, and schedule meetings. The next issue at play here is chamber dynamics. Each chamber has its own dynamics and rules. For example, HEA must have 60 votes to pass the Senate, which Republicans currently don't have. So any bill that goes through regular order must be bipartisan. But the House only needs a majority to pass HEA, which Republicans do have. However, previous bipartisan working relationships in the Senate have been damaged in recent months. For example, we saw tension during the nomination hearing for Secretary DeVos. So the open question here is, how and to what extent will Democrats and Republicans work together on HEA? The House and Senate leadership also have other legislative priorities than education. I've already mentioned healthcare and tax reform, but there are also conversations swirling around a large infrastructure package. These are complex and take a lot of time, thus slowing down the calendar and pushing HEA back even further. The executive branch also comes into play because they typically have their own policy priorities that may guide Congress as they draft bills. However, with so few people having been nominated to key positions in agencies, it makes it hard for Congress to know the administration's priorities and has slowed down the process. The administration and Congress has also been spending a lot of time focusing on various investigations. Finally, the midterm elections also have an impact. Although they are not until next November, they will slow things down considerably once 2018 hits. And that's because members don't want to take tough votes in an election year, and they will spend more time back home campaigning. But again, this provides a good opportunity for you to engage with them. However, the flip side is that it means that they will have less time to be here in DC voting on bills. So the chances of things happening decrease as we move into 2018. So what do we know? While these political realities suggest a large-scale HEA reauthorization may not happen this Congress, we do know that both Education Committee chairpersons say that they want to get HEA reauthorized this Congress. The House is likely to move much more aggressively because they can. As I said, they have a majority. More hearings will likely happen, and we may even see bill language drafted. And again, reconciliation could be the sleeper here when it comes to financial aid changes. It could come out of nowhere, so keep an eye on that. But really, nobody knows what will happen because of the political realities that I just mentioned. The best that we can do is be prepared for what comes next.
Well, thanks so much, Nancy. So now we want to turn to looking at a particular case study. And the case study we're going to examine for this type of advocacy work is looking at how the American Health Care Act is currently engaged in politics and what health advocates are doing in order to try and stop this particular bill. It's important to note that as we examine this, AccessLex Institute is a nonpartisan organization, excuse me, is a nonpartisan organization. And so we take no particular position on the utility or advocating for or against the American Health Care Act. We simply want to show this as a demonstration of why health advocates are typically successful in their advocacy work and what we can learn from them as an organization and as education advocates. There's several reasons why we want to jump into and look and examine as to why health advocates have been successful and why we want to look at the American Health Care Act, or what I'll call ACA for short. Is one, it's current in real time. And as we are even speaking about this, the Senate is negotiating their bill and things like that. And so it's important for us to see how we can utilize the tools that the health advocates have been using in education field and policy. Also, they're well coordinated and have been doing this for quite a long time. And they're actually moderately successful when it comes to getting their policies priorities. So there's things that we can learn from them. So let's take a look at the ACA for short. This is essentially as a repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And I'll note that the repeal is in quotations because it's not actually a total repeal. Because again, as Nancy alluded to, the method in which the majority is using to advance this bill is through reconciliation, and reconciliation has rules surrounding what can and cannot be inside of that. It's important to know that this is not the law yet. They have passed one branch of government and it is currently being negotiated in the Senate. Again, another reason why we're examining this so that we can examine real-time advocacy on the fly. So let's take a look at sort of the timeline from when the ACA was introduced all the way to what we have now. You'll notice that the bill was introduced on March 6th. It was actually scheduled for a markup 2 days later. A CBO score came out 1 week later. They had another manager amendment, and then the first vote that they had was ultimately pulled on the House floor on March 24th. You'll note that they went to essential recess through the entire month of April, came back in late April, had some negotiations going on at the White House, offered some amendments, and then ultimately it did pass the House by 2 votes. But here are the key takeaways. There were only 12 working days before the bill was pulled after it was introduced, and 24 working days before the actual legislation passed. Now, this is highly unusual for such massive, large-scale legislation, but this is again why Nancy's commentary on reconciliation was so important, is that typically these things take years to advance, but you can see that if a majority wants to, during the reconciliation process, they can move extraordinarily quickly. So let's first examine how health advocates utilized both before the ACA was introduced, during the ACA's sort of introduction into the House, and then what they've done since to examine a kind of full-scale advocacy effort. So let's take a look at what they did before. You'll notice that this article is dated on February 20th, an entire month before the ACA was introduced. And you'll note that health advocates do 4 particular things. They raise awareness, they educate the public, they shape the debate, and they build support. And those first 2 I want to focus on, raising awareness and educating the public. It's very important to note that one of the reasons why they were successful in getting the first bill passed, or excuse me, pulled off the House floor, is because people knew that this healthcare bill was coming. Raising awareness to the fact that something actually is going on in Congress is extraordinarily important. And so how does that translate to us? It's, for example, if you walked onto the street and asked 10 people whether they knew that PSLF was, eliminated in the president's budget, I can guarantee you that the majority of them didn't even know that it was presented. And so that presents a challenge to us as as education advocates in order to raise awareness about these proposals, whether it be PSLF, changes possibly to Grad Plus, loan counseling, etc. We need to build current awareness that these changes are actually potentially being talked about. And then the second is actually educating the public. What is it in these bills that they are proposing? For example, the president's budget of expanding IDR years or forgiveness under IDR to 30 years for graduate students, educating people about what's inside of the actual policy proposals. And doing that early allows health advocates and thus ourselves to really shape the debate in terms and on the terms that we would like to see advocated. So that's an important aspect. And then finally, doing so will ultimately build support for whatever advocacy movement that we're trying to entail. So let's then turn back quickly to the short time, again, 12 days between the time that the bill was introduced and ultimately the bill was pulled. Now, it's important to know that the faster these things move, the less time there is to react. So as Nancy alluded, that if changes to, student financial aid occur through the reconciliation process, there's going to be limited time for us to react. So it's important to stay on top of these things. And it's just really clear, as you can see, under this massive large-scale healthcare bill, that there was only 12 days in between the time that it was introduced and the time that it was voted on, ultimately pulled the first time. But we need to be very, 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 very cognizant, and I know I sound like a broken record, but very cognizant that reconciliation is a method that could be used to change some things in financial education. So let's talk about what the health advocates did during. So you'll note that these letters are all dated on March 7th. That is, of course, one day after the bill was introduced. So they immediately sprung into action. Now, all of them opposed it for different reasons because they have different constituencies, and you'll see typically if, for example, some changes to PSLF or things that we disagree with, as Nancy noted, we spring right into action putting out our statement as well. And so you'll see massive, large organizations who have large constituencies sort of do their opening salvo by writing letters of opposition or support, depending on what the issue is going to be, to start their advocacy campaigns off. But this is also a way for them to start their constituent engagement, and it lets their constituency knows that here goes the starting part of this particular fight or support of whatever may be coming. And then you'll note that one thing that as they start this, they continually apply pressure to legislators, so never letting up, because the moment that there's a slip up, then that's when things can happen. And so one of the things we want to focus on, again, as we alluded to back a few slides ago, is about this educating the public and understanding that health advocates have gotten extraordinarily good at this because they do it over and over and over. You'll notice that their message is extraordinarily compact and straight to the point. They talk about having a specific action. What do you need to do? You need to retweet this specific thing. And then they've boiled down what is their issue into one easily readable kind of message. So it says the age tax would force Americans age 50 to 64 to pay thousands more money in healthcare. It's just that simple. And then they boil it down to even a small hashtag. Tell Congress no age tax. And as you'll see that this video went viral, getting over 10,000 plays within the first few days that it was introduced. And you'll also note that the date on this is March 6th. So this video was prepared and ready to go on the very day that this bill was dropped. And so kind of that idea of springing right into action is extraordinarily important. It also gets their constituents engaged. They can retweet this and share this on other social media, thus expanding their message as wide as possible. And so you'll also note that these large organizations have these separate kind of websites available for educating about what are the facts. So one was getting people to understand that this was even happening, and the other half is actually letting them know what's inside of the bills or what are the proposals being offered. And so you'll see that the AMA and the AHA both have separate websites kind of designed to really inform the public about what are the proposals that are, being proposed in ACA, but also what is it that they support instead of the proposals that are inside. But you'll also see that they have both on both sites ways that people can immediately take direct action. So the AHA has email your senator, and then the AMA, which represents doctors, has both a take action for physicians as well as take action for their patients. Again, trying to broaden the constituency that can, engage with their members of Congress. And then finally, they have some alerts. So when it was time to actually take these actual votes, you'll see that these health organizations sprung into action saying, well, now is the time. Ultimately, we've been preparing you for this, so now you guys need to take these actions. And it all has a sense of urgency because the House was voting either the same day or a day prior when these alerts were sent out. And so you'll see it says, call this number and do this. Very specific. And we'll talk a little bit about what we do a little bit later on, but understanding that when we need to call on you guys in order to engage in this, this is what we need for you guys to jump straight into action, and which is why we're preparing so early now. And so let's talk about what happened after it ultimately passed the House. Then you had some negotiations currently going on in the Senate now. We are expected to get a new CBO score, and then ultimately, as Nancy alluded to, there is a recess coming up. And so there is some urgency, at least in the majority, to move ACA forward. But let's take a look at health advocates were doing after that. And so they capitalized on that exposure that they got from the immediate bill being pulled and then ultimately passing. So engaging with their members of Congress, going to their town halls, going to their meetings, and actually building on that support that they received from constituents and trying to really ratchet up the pressure on their members of Congress. And then you also note that they more organized from multiple sides and got different organizations. You'll see down in the lower left-hand corner that the NEA is one of the organizations that's opposed. Now, you don't typically see an education organization aligned with health organizations, but there are certain types of medical programs or medical funding that actually go to education. So what we encourage you as we move forward in our education campaign is to really broaden your horizons and not just think about, oh, I only need to align myself with education organizations, but there may be several organizations that have overlapping and intertwining constituencies, and that's what effective health advocates have been doing. And then as we discussed, taking direct action, calling, writing, and going to their town halls. And if you continue to do that, that cycle will kind of repeat itself. And you'll see in the next slide how that really reinforces, because ultimately congresspersons react to what happened when they were going to those town halls. And so you'll note that the choice quote that's kind of circled there is that we weren't stupid, which is what the majority's staffers said after saying that they didn't want this bill to become public prior to a certain date because they wanted to make sure that they could negotiate behind the scenes and they didn't want to have the public outcry. It's an effective method that the health advocates use to really build up and ratchet support against this particular bill. And you'll see that also they have these organizations have announced kind of very specific targeting. So once it moved over to the center, or excuse me, to the Senate, and after they stopped with their kind of broad-based activation of their membership to try and stop the bill, they moved to targeting specific members of Congress. So those who are in particular hard districts or particular hard states, those health advocates went to go and target those by, direct action, writing, calling, et cetera, et cetera. And then just as a follow-up, you'll even see that the AARP, their advocates, they actually, as the Senate negotiations were taking place, they actually activated their members and focused solely on that new priority. So originally it was about this age tax, but then they also added this idea that, give us the bill. Where is this bill? Where is it so that we can see it? And so changing their message on the fly, being malleable, is extraordinarily important. And so what are some key critical lessons that we can learn from health advocates as they were working in opposition to this particular bill? Is that these first things is it's necessary to educate the public. Again, as I go back to and say, how many of your students know that changes to IDR could be coming, or PSLF, anything like that? It's important to know that you need to inform your constituencies, your students, your faculty, your school about that these things could be coming, let alone about what is actually in these bills, but just understanding that these could be coming. And then ultimately educating them about what are the policy proposals that are being advanced. It's important to build coalitions. Again, the larger and more vast number of people that you have working for or against a particular bill will help you in terms of your advocacy. And then it's critical to engage in direct action. So calling and writing and showing up to town halls or other member events is extraordinarily important. It puts pressure on them. As you saw, legislators and lawmakers will react accordingly. And then finally, none of this is actually useful without you. It's ultimately you back in their districts, back in their home states, that will ultimately make the difference. So now I want to turn to our specific advocacy campaign that AccessLex is launching in terms of advocating for our priorities. And so we have a new campaign called Make the Case for Legal Education. You can get the pun there. And we're going to be making the case for a lot of the policy proposals that we would like to see. And so some of these things that Nancy alluded to prior were about, maintaining the PSLF, having it more loan counseling, things like that. And so we're going to talk about what we provide in helping you in order to get your start on advocacy. So let's walk through the toolkit that we've provided. And so just as those large health organizations, we also have our own statements. And we will be putting out statements should other policy proposals come up in the future. As you noted, when the president, as Nancy noted, when the president put out his budget earlier this year, we actually had a statement of opposition to certain priorities in terms of PSLF elimination, as well as increase to IDR forgiveness for graduate students. So we'll have statements in the future as well. We also have those action alerts that we saw earlier, and I'll speak more in detail about that a little bit later on. We have issue one pagers, which is about the education of what are the policy proposals we're advocating. And then we provide you some advocacy tips, also give you a phone script and a letter writing script so that you can engage in that work. And then in the future, we're already a part of a few coalitions working behind the scenes to really advance some of our policy priorities. And then in the future, we'll engage in some debate shaping in the future. And so here's just an example of one of the action alerts that we sent out. Hopefully you received this. This is, of course, when the president introduced his budget, and you'll note that we make note of what actually was in the proposal, so elimination of PSLF, et cetera, et cetera. And we sent this out via email, and it's also on our website. And so in the future, should we need to activate you, you'll note at the bottom it says call your representative or write your members of Congress. And so we provide links to you so that you can engage in that work directly as well. Here's an example of some of the fact sheets / talking points that we offer. And so you'll note that on these things, and this one particularly about student loan counseling, it'll have our ultimate proposal in the upper right-hand corner. It'll provide some background information about what's the current law and how we think the law should be changed, and also then provide you some useful facts and talking points that you can engage in with your members or other constituencies so that you can educate the public about that. And then we have those for our 4 top priorities, including the loan counseling, IDR, PSLF, and bar loans as well. And then we also have one for a broad-ranging HEA recommendations. Then we provide how you can contact your member of Congress kind of fact sheet so that you can find out who you need to call via a phone number or a website so that you can find out who your particular member of Congress is in the House and then who your senators are in the Senate. You'll also see that we give you a sample phone script about a particular thing and then one that you can kind of fill in the blanks, whatever it is, the issues that you choose. And we have this again for both calling and writing your members of Congress. And so now we want to kind of tell you how you can kind of get involved in both your personal and professional capacity to get involved really in this. And so one of the first things you need to do is choose whatever issue is important to you and your school. So it may be PSLF, it may be IDR repayment, it may be more loan counseling. Whatever issue that you are passionate about, choose those one or two issues and really understand back and front kind of those issues and then begin to advocate that. And so you want to educate the public. And so that includes your students. Again, understanding that, letting them know that this is actually a potential change that could occur. And then what is that potential change that could occur? And then figuring out what is it that you want to advocate for so you can tell your constituents, your students, your faculty, your staff, other staff members, other people of the broader school that you may be a part of, getting them just aware that these things are happening and what are the changes that you'd like to see. And then ultimately, you need to engage your member of Congress. So call them, write them, show up to town halls, invite them to events, as we'll talk about. And then whatever resources we provide, you can obviously use us as resources. That includes, some of our research papers that we've sponsored or written ourselves, and all the tools that are available in our Make the Case campaign. In terms of your actual school advocacy, we encourage you to really start building relationships with your members of Congress, inviting them for speaking roles at your schools, or inviting them to other random events that we have or you have at your law school. And then maybe hosting policy panels where you invite them as to be an expert on the panel. They love, love, love to be the center of attention. And so certainly engaging your member that way. And then whatever additional resources that we can provide. But we really strongly encourage you to start establishing, if you don't already have, relationships with your members of Congress and make sure they know that you are important to them. As law schools, it's important to know that you are a very big constituency. We have people coming from out of state or some state, in-state people coming and visiting their law schools. So it's important to know that you matter to them. And the more that you can engage with them, the better off it will be when you come to time, you make that phone call, hey, Senator or Congressperson, we really can't put PSLF, that would hurt some of our students. Having those relationships allows you to better relate and connect with your member. And then on the flip side, you have this advocacy campaign where you can simply write your letters, do the phone calls, things that we've mentioned before. I would just point out it's important, as we move into this new era, social media has become extraordinarily more important. And so you'll note that the AARP advocate video went viral. So if you can get these types of things, members of Congress really will respond to those things. And finally, the biggest lesson, as we said, is you are the key to all of this. You are their constituents. We can advocate as much as we want on the Hill, engage with members, and we are doing that. But ultimately, it is you who are the constituents in the state and the district, which will make the ultimate difference. And so we just encourage you to engage in this work, however you feel comfortable, and we will continue to do that in the future. But you are going to be the key if any changes are to occur. And then finally, just want to offer and end with a few reminders. Every week, AccessLex Institute writes a higher ed roundup, which is a great, great, great resource on our website that you can see on our blog. And basically, we give you no frills, no nonsense, just what happened in Washington that is relevant to you. And so we have this week in Washington, which talks about what has occurred in both the legislative, executive, and sometimes judicial branch. What are official actions taken? And then we have a second section where it talks about just kind of third-party reports, things that you may be interested in that relate to higher education. And then finally, what recent pieces of legislation has been introduced that typically deal with higher ed and education issues. And then finally, of course, you should be registering for our financial aid conference and our symposium, which is coming up. As you can see on the screen, it's going to be in awesome Florida, so you definitely want to make sure that you have a chance to attend. And also, we will be having another advocacy session at the financial aid conference where you can meet us face to face, walk through some of that work that we're doing. And then finally, of course, if you need to access our campaign, you can go there at accesslex.org/advocacy campaign. Of course, you can find it on the main site, and you can reach us via Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And just as one final reminder that you will receive this in the future as a PDF, and all the pictures are clickable and linked, so you don't have to remember any of this. You can just click on those links. And then finally, we just want to say thank you so much for your time this afternoon. These are our email addresses, so if you have any additional questions, you can of course email us afterwards. And thank you. And again, you are the key to this, and so we really appreciate you taking out the time to engage in the work to make the case for legal education.